In Genesis chapter 10, we have the genealogy of Noah and his 3 sons. And it seems like a boring record of names until we're told about one mysterious figure named Nimrod. And he seems to have a connection to the Tower of Babel and possibly even the Nephilim, those giants of old in Genesis 6. So who is this ancient giant warrior king, and what is his connection to Babylon? And why is the genealogy concerned with him more than anyone? You're about to find out. And so we need to make several key observations in this video to really bring all of this together. So let's jump into Genesis chapter 10 and read this story a bit differently than you might be used to. Hey there and welcome to Different Bible Study. I'm Jason Camacho. If you don't know me, welcome to the channel. If you're looking to understand the Bible on a deeper level and looking to, learn how to study the Bible, this is the channel for you. We're in Genesis chapter 10 today. I'm just going to, it's just a lot of repetition. So I'm only going to read the parts that I think are relevant to what I've prepared. Genesis chapter 10, you can read the whole chapter on your own. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We'll get to their order, and if it's in any particular order, which some people like to point out, sons were born to them after the flood. There have been some speculations about, who was really on the ark and were there kids present that weren't noted because they weren't significant to the story. Well, we are told that sons were born to Noah's sons after the flood, and it's as simple as that. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, and you have all these beautiful names. From these, the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations. Now, this is going to be a common template, you might say, that gets copied and pasted. You have the coastland peoples. They have their land. They have their language. I'm going to highlight this in green as well. They have their clan, and they have their nation, right? And that's going to map onto Ham's sons, or Ham. It's going to map onto Shem's sons. So the sons of Ham, because I know that's how a lot of people are going to pronounce it, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. That should sound very familiar. Then you have all the sons of Cush and Rama, and then you have Cush fathering a man named Nimrod. I'm going to unhighlight all this because we're not here yet. Nimrod here is the first on the earth to be a mighty man. We're going to revisit him. He's a mighty warrior before the Lord, and therefore it's said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, growing up, I've never heard Nimrod in this used in this way. Usually when you call someone a Nimrod, it's not a good thing. They're a knucklehead, they're dumb, they're an airhead. And so the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And you should be thinking, I know that name. It sounds familiar. Tower of Babel in the next chapter. In the land of Shinar. From that land, he went into Assyria. This is going to be a key player in the Old Testament, along with Nineveh. These names should sound very familiar. Nineveh, Calah, that is the great city, right? Jonah is going to be told to go to Nineveh, that great city. We have Egypt right here, key player, especially in the Exodus. The Philistines are going to come from Casluhim. And then you have Canaan. Remember the Canaanites in the Old Testament? They are removed from the land of Canaan so that the Israelites can occupy that territory. And then you have Sidon, Tyre and Sidon later on. The Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites. So you have all these key players who are adversaries to Israel throughout the biblical story coming from Ham. And you're like, wow, that's a lot of adversaries coming from one family. This maps on perfectly to Genesis 4 with Cain's lineage. I think that's my own understanding. The territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar, and I'm not familiar with ancient geography as much as I would like to be in that ancient world, but one day I will be. Sodom and Gomorrah, you're like, okay, I know them. These are the sons of Ham, okay? So a lot of nations, peoples, clans, tribes that are typically viewed as more negative in the Old Testament, all coming from Ham. To Shem, though, also the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth. So we know that Shem is the elder brother of Japheth. What about Ham? This is where people speculate, if he's the brother of Japheth, but not Ham, maybe there's some weird mixing of bloodlines going on, where he's a half-son of Noah, which I don't speculate that far. Could be a possibility. But the sons of Shem, all these guys, beautiful names, to Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Pelleg. In his days, the earth was divided. Now, this right here, this word is very unique. We're going to do a quick study, and I'm going to show you. It's used here in Genesis chapter 10, right? This word that gets translated as split, to separate, to make a division, or some kind of furrow. And you're going to see in Genesis chapter 10, the people at Babel, they're going to disperse. In that sense, humanity is divided, and they're spread across the earth. The same way that the 4 rivers in Eden, going through Eden, are split into 4. That one river becoming 4, it's divided. So you have all these names, wonderful. The territory in which they lived extended from Mesha in the east, okay, hill country of the east. Important, I think, spiritual geography, directionally speaking. These are the sons of Shem by their clans. Remember I told you this is going to be important. The clans, the languages, the lands, and their nations. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies in their nations. And from these, the nations spread. There's that idea of the earth or people being divided on the earth after the flood. Now, real quick, when you go down to chapter 11, you're going to see, I think it's at the end. I could be mistaken. Yes, it's in the beginning. Duh. The whole earth, the Tower of Babel story opens with a focus in on the language and the words and the land or the region they're occupying in Shinar, and then a people which flows perfectly out of this. The lands, the language, the nations. We're about to see the nations and tongues flow out of Babel in the next chapter. So let's back it up. We're going to answer 4 basic questions in this study. What does the passage say? What does it mean? Because you can understand what the Bible says and quote it, but you can also misunderstand what it means. So we want to know, what does this mean? How does this apply to our lives? And then how does this all point to Jesus ultimately? So stick around till the end for that. And then if you really enjoy this teaching, like this video and subscribe for more content like this. We have our Genesis series on Thursdays. Typically, and I say typically, we have Matthew studies on Mondays, and then on Saturdays, narrative patterning. I've been really inconsistent with all the big things happening in my life. Hopefully I find some rhythm in the near future here. But on Thursday nights, we also have a follow-up conversation on our Discord server. Would love for you to join us. That's at 8 p.m. We just kind of, have a follow-up conversation on what we're going through each week. We dive back into the scriptures, ask questions, revisit any confusing passages, make connections. And then if you have kids in your life, you're trying to grow in the faith, order your Scripture Creature cards today at thescripturecreatures.com. These are Bible trading cards designed by me and my kids for other children to learn not just what the Bible says, but what it means, and to learn how to study the Bible. So back to the text. We are going to make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 key observations. I didn't note that in the beginning. My apologies. But we want to keep in mind as we enter into the genealogy of Noah, this comes right after what Ham just did in violating his father somehow. And then Noah curses Ham's son Canaan, then turns around and blesses his 2 other sons. And right after that, we have this genealogy. So Genesis 10 seems to have a very similar flow to Genesis 4. We have Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and then another son is born to Adam and Eve named Seth, who replaces Abel, because Cain is also, an exile. He's, kicked out of the land and sent off as a wanderer. And so there's a very similar, I think, literary structure here. The line of Canaan in chapter 4 has a bunch of innovation and achievement and expansion, while Abel just dies. And then Seth takes his place. And for the most part, Seth has very good descendants, while Cain's line is pretty wicked and evil. And here we'll see what's highlighted more about the predominantly wicked line of Ham is their achievements, their expansion, their innovation, which is not always a positive thing. While Shem and Japheth, the other 2 sons, they have other things highlighted about their descendants, not just the innovation and the expansion and the power and the notoriety and fame, which is primarily linked to Nimrod. But I digress. The first observation is this: the order of the sons. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. As we exit chapter 9, it's important to note the order in which Noah's sons are listed. Some people want to point out that Ham is not the youngest son of Noah because, look, he's listed second. So he must be the second born. And every time he is listed second, when you have the three brothers, whether or not this is true, I can see the significance in that. Like if Ham was born second, but then Noah demoted him to the status of third born and last in line when Noah curses Canaan, then this would show how Ham's actions forfeited his second born status in the family. The only problem, I think, with that is back in verse 24, we are told that Noah's youngest son did something to him. Noah comes to his senses, realizes his youngest son did something to him, and we only know of Ham doing something in that text to Noah. So Ham is referred to as the youngest, whether he is, I think he's born as the youngest. He's not demoted to that status. But there doesn't seem to be any particular order necessarily, because the genealogies are about to start with Japheth. So if we think about the order that's used here, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, this genealogy doesn't follow that order. Instead, we have Japheth first. And you might say, well, we're working backwards here. I just think you have two different orders if you want to make sense of it and say that we need to make conclusions based off the order, and it's significant here. You'd have to decide arbitrarily which of the two orders you're going to choose from. And this chapter opens with the sons. Their descendants seem to be the result of what took place in the last chapter. Like all the nations and all the things that are done with their descendants seems to be a result of what happened in the last chapter. The biblical authors seem to make sense of what transpires later on in history with these nations by linking those moments to chapter 9 and the actions of the sons. In verse 2, we have Magog. Magog is a familiar, significant character in Ezekiel's prophecy, as well as in the great battle described in Revelation. We're going to skip down to verse 5. Again, not everything is noteworthy here. The second observation is nations spreading across the land. This is referring to how the people are dispersed or scattered across the face of the land, like we'll see in Genesis 11. This is kind of prepping you for that. You're about to see the nations come out of Babel. And so far in the narrative, we have not seen any reference to multiple lands or nations or languages or clans. The only reference to land so far seems to have been one singular land mass that was the focus of the story. And so we should be asking, why is it significant that we're introduced to these ideas now with Noah's sons and their descendants? How is this concept of multiple nations and multiple tongues and multiple languages and lands, how are these concepts different from what we've experienced so far in the last 9 chapters of Genesis? So if there were separate kingdoms or territories up to this point before Noah, each with their own divided lands, why has there been no mention of that? Why only now are we told? This is significant. Pay attention. We're going to see some big rival nations. That's the third observation. This becomes very important for laying the foundation for the rest of biblical history in the Old Testament, with Israel primarily. There are some big rival nations. You have Cush, you have Egypt, you have Babylon, you have Assyria, you have Nineveh, you have the Canaanites. All of these are key figures in the rest of the biblical story, and they will be some of the main adversaries of God's people, along with even the Philistines being listed in verse 14. They all come from Ham, who is said to have done something unspeakable to dishonor his father in the last chapter. And Ham's descendants will be some of the worst adversaries on the planet, yet it's Canaan. If you remember in chapter 9, Noah specifically targeted and cursed Canaan in the last chapter. So Canaan will occupy the promised land and will become all the ites, the Jebusites, the Hivites. So if Noah cursed Canaan, does this mean the rest of Ham's sons were unaffected by that curse that Noah pronounced? Because people want to point that out. Well, Noah didn't curse the rest of Ham's sons, just Canaan. And so what makes Canaan different or cursed from the other of his brothers and descendants? We're going to skip down to verse 8, and we're going to see a man named Nimrod who comes from Cush. So Nimrod becomes the grandson of Ham up here. He was the first on the earth to be a mighty man. And you're like, cool, he's a strong fella. He's like a Samson. But here's the fourth observation, is Nimrod the mighty warrior. So we should be asking, I think, why does the author mention one specific individual out of all the descendants of Ham? I'm going to use Ham and Ham interchangeably. It's just how I work. The author pauses the genealogy to say, hey, there's someone you should really pay attention to who was significant from Ham's line. He's a mighty man, or a mighty hunter is how it can be translated, which I think refers to the kind of mighty men of renown we saw in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, just to refresh your memory. The Nephilim, which are the fallen ones, or giants, the fallen, they were on the earth in those days and afterward. So even after the flood, we're told the Nephilim are still there. They weren't completely wiped out, meaning the flood was not the remedy to the Nephilim necessarily. Otherwise, God, you might say, failed. I don't think that was necessarily his target. But when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore children. These Nephilim were the mighty men, just like how Nimrod's referred to, of old, men of renown, or men of the name, literally in Hebrew, men of reputation and notoriety and fame, right? They have a reputation in the earth as being mighty warriors who really are unstoppable. So you might want to consider that Nimrod, being a mighty hunter, just like one of those warriors in Genesis 6, and again, this is following the story of the flood. It makes sense. Consider that Nimrod might be a Nephilim, or Nephilim, however you want to pronounce it, because they are on the earth after the flood. And this is the same word used in Genesis 6 to describe the Nephilim, being giant warriors, or Gibborim, mighty men of renown, or men of the name. Pretty much how Nimrod is described here, to such a degree, it says right here, he's a mighty hunter before the Lord, which you might think that is suggesting that he's on God's side. I don't think that's the case at all. But I think he gets God's attention in this unique way where God is going to do something and act specifically towards him, the way that Babel is going to get the attention of God in the next chapter. And since Nimrod is linked to Babel, and you're like, how is he linked to Babel? The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So part of Nimrod's kingdom, the origin story of his kingdom, involves Babel, which is the place where the tower is going to be built and the city where people are going to try and make a name for themselves. They say, let's make a name for ourselves. Let's make ourselves great and ascend to God. They build a ziggurat. We'll get to that in the next chapter. And so linking that to Nimrod is not a stretch to say that he's getting God's attention in a negative way, the way that human innovation will get the attention of God in the next chapter, which does not seem to be a positive thing. And it says he was the first on the earth right here. He was the first on the earth to be a mighty man, or he began to be a mighty man on the earth, I think is more of a literal translation. When you read it in Hebrew, he began to be a mighty man on the earth. So if Nimrod is the first on the earth to be a mighty man, is this in reference to the new world? Like he's the first in the new world to be a mighty man? Because we saw other mighty hunters and mighty warriors in Genesis 6. So this must refer to the new world. I would say where the story is heading with the Tower of Babel, it seems like Nimrod is put in a different category than everyone else. He's set apart, and not in a positive way. And there will be several individuals that will be referred to as mighty men, like King Saul, or some of David's mighty men, or King Jehoshaphat as his own mighty men, has his own mighty men. Some of them will be mighty men of valor, like we see with Gideon and Naaman the Syrian commander. In other words, these men who are referred to as mighty men, right? He's not just a mighty hunter, right? He's a mighty man as well. Most often when you see that language, it refers to a warrior. This is why Nimrod is thought to be a warrior king, at least, if not a giant warrior king. Like Joshua will go in, and this is not a stretch, Joshua is going to go into the promised land and deal with giant kings one at a time. So does Moses. He deals with Og, and he deals with, I can't remember the other one's name, but he deals with these giant warrior kings who are linked to the Nephilim. So Nimrod seems to be one of those, having his own kingdom. And so the last and most notable reference to a hunter-warrior kind of man was Lamech, one of Cain's descendants. That's why I think this genealogy of Shem, Ham, and Japheth really does parallel the Genesis 4 genealogy of Cain and Seth. And so the first man to murder his fellow man after Cain was Lamech, and he escalates the violence and the bloodshed of Cain. Cain's line will be full of these men, these mighty men, that seem to play a role in the invention of tools and weapons. And so they seem to be these kind of mighty warrior hunters. So I don't think it's Nimrod is set forth as a hero, but as a villain. Meaning when it says he's before the Lord, that's in opposition to. Here's the fifth observation, Nimrod's beginning. I'm going to spend a little more time on Nimrod because of how much the story is going to shift onto Babel in the next chapter. Technically, in the Hebrew, it says that Nimrod, again, I said this, he began to be a mighty man, or right here, sorry, he began to be a mighty man on the earth. And the only reason I point that out is because he's a mighty champion on the earth. And this links us back to the previous story with Noah, where you kind of sense the ominous music kind of increasing and that ominous tension increasing. And it says, Noah began to be a man of the soil. And you think, dun, 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 this is not good. This is setting the tone for something that is not good. And what do you know? Ham does something. And Noah began to be a man of the soil. I link it to that because it's the same word. But also, and I made an argument, a better argument in the last video. You can go watch that. But in chapter 6, when the Noah story opens, it says, when man began to multiply. And this is not good. This is not humanity increasing God's image, but unfortunately, the serpent's image in the earth, and they're taking daughters of man, and they're taking whoever they see, and there's this unholy mixing going on, and it's not anything good. And I think when he began to be a mighty man on the earth, we've seen a couple instances already where that Hebrew word is linked to nothing good. It has a negative connotation. I think to be consistent, not to say this couldn't break out of the norm, but to be consistent, at least we should consider that because those other two instances had a negative connotation, so does this. He began to be a mighty hunter. And what is he hunting? Animals, people. He's just said to be a mighty hunter before the Lord, which means I think he's towards God's face or in the presence of God, and not in a good way, but this seems to be like the shaking of the fist in rebellion, how this has God's attention. Nimrod is opposed to God, which is consistent with the idea of rebellion we see in the Bible. So verse 10, it says, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. And where is the Tower of Babel going to be built? In the land of Shinar. So was Nimrod overseeing the Tower of Babel project in the land of Shinar? Are we to see him as part of that? Or did he just kind of conquer, get his people in place, and then they move forward with that project, and he moved on to other places? Or did Nimrod start his kingdom in Babel, again, and then the people just initiated the Babel project under his oversight, at a distance, while he moved into other regions? Something to consider. Did Nimrod come into Babel after the whole Tower of Babel project had been already shut down? Like, are we to see the Tower of Babel get shut down and then Nimrod picks that back up and continues it? Either way, he's said to have built Nineveh as well. From that land, he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Again, two key figures in the Old Testament. And what do I have here? It doesn't say he built the first 4 cities here, just that these 4 cities are the beginning of his kingdom. So he could have conquered them, these cities that are already, getting off the ground, or he did build them. How did he rise to power, though? Did he acquire a following or gain the people's love and affection, kind of like Absalom will, David's son? Or did he build these 4 cities too? The first 4 cities of his kingdom do remind me, personally, of the 4 rivers flowing out of Eden. I'm not sure why, but it is the start of his kingdom, and it's focused on the region of Shinar, meaning the Tower of Babel project could be him getting his kingdom off the ground. And God has to come down and deal with that. The 6th observation is the serpent's rival kingdom. Now, this seems to speak of Nimrod's beginnings, his kingdom's beginnings, because, again, the beginning of his kingdom is in Babel, which gets more attention in the next chapter. So here we have the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom. Likely, I think, to be consistent with the context, it makes the most sense that his kingdom is in opposition to God's kingdom. We have God in the beginning making the world, right? In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. And now we have rebellious, prideful man starting his own kingdom in rebellion to God, trying to rise to the level of God's kingdom as a rival entity, which is what the Tower of Babel project represents: human ambition, untamed and rebellious. So this is consistent with the theme of the seed of the serpent in Genesis 3, opposing the seed of the woman. In other words, Nimrod seems to be building his own thing, in contrast with Noah. Noah builds the ark that the Lord commanded him to build. He's building what is consistent with God's heart and will. And we know that the parable of the wise and foolish builders, in Matthew chapter 7, he says, one man builds a house on the rock, one man builds a house on the sand, and eventually the storm waters come and reveal what God has built, because only what God builds will last, which is what is built on his word, the rock of his son. So you have these 2 contrasting images. What Nimrod is building will not last. God's going to shut it down, though someone's going to pick it back up, namely Nebuchadnezzar later on, and try and continue that, and God's going to shut that down. It's like, man, people continue to try and pick up what God has said stop. With Joshua, he tears down Jericho, and God says, whoever rebuilds the gates of this city, let him be cursed. And what do you know? It's going to be at the expense of a future king's son who comes in and tries to rebuild the ruins of Jericho and those gates, and it's at the expense of his son. So that's an idea that is followed throughout the Old Testament. But I link it to the parable of the 2, builders, because Nimrod is building something out of pride and rebellion, in contrast with what Noah built, which was the ark in obedience and humility and trust. So the same verb in verse 11, let's read it. From that land he went into Assyria, built Nineveh, right? The verb used of Nimrod, building, right here, I'm going to highlight it in green. He built. It is to bana. It's the same verb used of God making Eve in Genesis 2, which was a unique verb. That is not the action verb used to describe Adam's creation, only Eve's. So something is being made, proceeding out of something that already exists. And that in that story, Eve was brought out of Adam's side, from his rib, you might say. Nimrod here is building Nineveh out from that land. He came from, Assyria, and ends up building Nineveh. He went into Assyria, and built Nineveh. And again, this seems like an attempt to rival God's creative power and kingdom, which is what the Tower of Babel, again, represents in the next story. I'm just trying to set the tone and make all the connections to the Tower of Babel I can to say, hey, that's not just a random story that just gets thrown in there to be like, and we have languages. But it's to say, no, we're building to that. Humanity is actually paving the way for that. We're seeing the story build to that point. And considering the role that Assyria will play in the biblical story, what does it tell us about Nimrod? That he had a role to play in the origins of Assyria and Babylon, these 2 nations that will destroy Israel and Judah, the northern and southern kingdoms. So he builds 4 cities in the Shinar region, which is going to be the region of Babylon. Then he builds 3 cities in Assyria as part of his kingdom. Like, his kingdom's really growing. And think about, again, what Assyria and Babylon will do, how significant that is, and how the biblical authors are saying, yeah, those big bad guys that destroyed Israel and Judah, their origin story is linked to this man named Nimrod. How developed were these regions and nations before Nimrod got there? We don't know. But considering how the genealogy of Noah's sons is framed up as the origin story of all the other nations in the biblical world, it makes sense to see Nimrod, I think, as a key figure as in the formation of these nations. So verse 12, I know this is like a lot of information, just like some things I've noticed. Rezin between Nineveh, Calah, that is the great city. Again, I pointed this out, but in Jonah's story, God calls Jonah to go to the great city, Nineveh. And I think that's what's in focus here. Nineveh is the great city. Yet we don't see either of these two cities elsewhere in the biblical story, Calah and Rezin, between Nineveh. So Nineveh is really going to get some focus in the story. The verse 13, the seventh observation is the origin of Egypt. Now, we all know Egypt. We all know the Exodus story. We all know Moses and the Red Sea and the staff turning into a snake like you do on a Saturday morning. But the origin of Egypt, now the focus is on Cush and his descent, off of Cush and his descendant Nimrod, and onto Ham's other son, Egypt. And when you hear Egypt, you obviously think Exodus story. Egypt becomes another big adversary to Israel at times, especially before they become their own national entity after the Exodus. But now we have Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria all descending from Ham. So most of the key enemies of Israel seem to come from his line. What does that tell us about Nimrod as well in connection to these things? And what does it tell us about Noah cursing Canaan and not these guys? But we also have the Philistines. Philistines become a big problem later on for the people of Israel. And I just want to consider what the story focused on. When it spoke of Cush, it spoke of Nimrod, his conquests, his mighty power, his reputation, his kingdom, his achievements, and his expansion, and the fact that he got God's attention. But then we get to Egypt, right, another son. And the only notable thing is that the Philistines, are coming from his line. Now we have the Egyptians and the Philistines coming from Egypt, and Babylon and Assyria coming from Cush, and all these nations are connected. But back to the comparison between Egypt and Cush and what the story emphasizes about both. With Cush's genealogy, it's about what his descendants do. They did these things. Nimrod accomplished these things. But we don't get that with Egypt. With Egypt's genealogy, it's just about the names of his sons. And with Canaan, in verse 15, it's a different focus. So with each of these key sons of Ham, there's something being emphasized that's different. In verse 15, Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites. So we have all the ites coming from Canaan, and then that's really it. And verse 15 through 20 talks about these are the sons of Ham by their clans, languages, lands, and nations. Observation number 8, the different focuses. And I pointed this out, but for Canaan, his genealogy is about the tribes, nations that come from him, not the individual sons like Egypt's genealogy, but the tribes and nations that come from Canaan. So, for example, it doesn't use the personal names of Canaan's sons, but rather it speaks of just the Amorites, Girgashites, like the tribes and clans. And the focus is on their land and territory, right? But for Cush, it's about what Nimrod did and how he expanded. But for Egypt, it's about his sons and the Philistines, and that's kind of it. So with Canaan, it's about the tribes and all the boundaries and their territories. But in verse 21, things shift to Shem, the oldest blessed one. And just like we saw in verse 5 with Japheth's genealogy, we're seeing the land and the languages and the tribes and the nations that come from Ham, and we also see the same thing is happening with Shem. Ham gets a lot of attention. The chapter spends 15 verses on Ham's descendants, but then Shem will get like 10 verses in the next section, while in the next chapter, Shem's genealogy gets 22 verses of attention. So if you're like, if Shem is the blessed firstborn, why does he get less focus? Why does he get less airtime than Ham? Well, because the next chapter is actually going to be dedicated more to the specific genealogy of Shem and how it leads to Father Abraham. So the structure of the son's genealogy seems to reflect the structure we saw in Genesis 4. Again, in Genesis 4, we're told about Cain's descendants, everything they did, and then we get to Seth, the righteous line, you might say, and they don't get much airtime until chapter 5. The next chapter is dedicated more to the specifics of his descendants, leading to Noah. And so one man is highlighted in Shem's genealogy here, just like one man is highlighted in Adam's genealogy, Seth's genealogy in chapter 5. You have Noah in chapter 5 being that righteous figure God's going to work with. And then in chapter 11 and 12, you have God calling another man out from among Babylon named Abraham. He's going to be God's new righteous partner. So this is all about nations and tongues and lands and countries, and it's setting the tone for the rest of the story. Now, verse 25 is, I don't know anything about this, but it just says, to Eber were born two sons. The first one's name is Peleg. I just think Pegleg. For in his days the earth was divided. His brother's name was Joktan. So this is an important time marker to reference when he was alive. Like, what time was he alive? Well, when the earth was divided. And that's an interesting detail, and we don't know what this exactly means, but this is a unique phrase. We see the promised land being divided between the tribes later on of Israel. So maybe if we map this out on a timeline, this would align with the Tower of Babel story, where the people of earth are dispersed by language in the next chapter. And in that story, the earth is divided among the people by their language, and they're dispersed to go and find their land where all of them who speak of that tongue will live. And that story seems to be hinted at, I think, with the mention of Nimrod here. So we skip down to verse 31. The sons of Shem, the nations of the world, their race, their speech, their territories, their people, all flow from the decisions their ancestors made, namely the sons of Noah in chapter 9. And in the next story, we're going to be told how they spread to become their own people by their own speech and territory. Last observation is this, setting up the Babel story. And we've just been touching on this over and over and over. I know I sound like a broken record, but I hope that you're starting to really catch it now. We have all the components of the Babel story right here. The names, the speech, the territory, the ethnic identity. Nations seem to be passively divided as God is doing the dividing and dispersing them here, like we do see in the next chapter. And in some ways, we're back to the state of Genesis 6. In some ways, we've made it full circle. The question really is, how will God respond to evil this time? Will he respond the same way he did in the earlier portion of Noah's story with the flood? The answer is no. He promised he would never do that again. But this time, he's going to respond to evil differently by dispersing them, not with a flood, but with confusion and with personal intervention, where he shuts down the human project known as Babel. So here's some application points for us before we get lost in all those details. Don't build your life apart from God. It's so easy to find yourself building something that you have not actually been commissioned by God to do, or you haven't checked back in to make sure he's actually approving of that, like making sure his favor is on what you're building. We see this most with, Nimrod and Babel. Sin has generational impact. So just be considering. I think we're seeing that with Ham. And whatever he did, there is an impact. That doesn't mean people are going to suffer or going to be condemned for the sins of their fathers. Everyone is personally responsible for their own sin. But there is a generational impact and a dimension of my sin affecting those that come after me, and to be mindful of that. And how power, in one context, building something is good when it's in leagues with God and his will, and he's commissioned you to do that. And in another context, it's Nimrod, building his own empire like a Nebuchadnezzar. And power can become this nasty tool if it's in opposition to God and if it's misused. So we should be careful how we wield any degree of power and responsibility and authority God's given us. God sees and responds to pride. We'll see in the next chapter. So just be mindful as I'm walking with God. In what ways is he dealing with my prideful, selfish ambition that goes unchecked? It's on us to be a little more self-reflective. And then the last thing is God's plan always prevails. We'll see that this is what mankind does. And then eventually it culminates with the Tower of Babel. And then God's going to shut it down and call one man out from Babel, after all the dust has settled, up from the ashes, one arises named Abraham. And so how does this all point to Jesus? Number one, when you see Nimrod, you almost see like the dark empire of the enemy versus God's kingdom, right? You can almost say Nimrod versus Jesus, which some have linked to Revelation and the Antichrist, and we're not going to get into that. But Nimrod builds something in rebellion. Jesus builds the kingdom of God, ultimately, which lasts. You have Babel versus Pentecost, right? Babel is where the languages were divided, whereas when Jesus brings the Spirit on the day of Pentecost, where the Israelites are present in Jerusalem from these nations, they bring back the good news of the gospel with the Spirit to those places. So God is gathering the nations, not in the way you'd think, but by His Spirit and by His gospel in the Son. You have the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. That theme is present here. You almost have Nimrod versus Noah in a sense. Nimrod represents rebellion, and Jesus is the true seed of the woman who crushes the head of the serpent. You have the man-made kingdom again versus God's kingdom. Nimrod's building his thing. Jesus builds the eternal kingdom of God, namely a people, and the temple being His family. And then the scattered nations versus Jesus redeeming them, which I hinted at. There's just all these different moments, I think, throughout this very simple genealogy where it's like, oh, I see a gap that Jesus will fill. I see a deficiency that Jesus will supply. And that's present throughout most of the Old Testament. You're like, that guy didn't do it. I thought he was the righteous one. And it's like, oh, Jesus will be the better version of him. And so in the next section, we arrive at the famous Tower of Babel story. And you might be tempted to think, I know this story. I already know it's super simple. There's not much to it. But man, when you see what's actually going on under the surface, you might just be surprised. And we might even link this to the Exodus. We might link this to other stories like Genesis 3 and 4. But we'll save that for the next video. We'll see what we end up doing. In the meantime, follow our reading plan. Join us Thursday nights for a follow-up discussion. Go to thescripturecreatures.com to get your pack of scripture creatures for your kids. And I'll see you guys in the next video.